Totally, again, obliterated. That's how President Trump described what would happen to Iran's missile program on the day this current war began, back in February. Nearly 5 months and hundreds of airstrikes later, American intelligence assessments reported in US media say Iran still retains roughly 70% of its pre-war missile stockpile and roughly 70% of its mobile launchers. So what actually happened to that promise? The answer, it turns out, isn't in the missiles themselves. It's in the mountains they're hidden inside. TBN, Israel, recently published exclusive footage described as offering a rare look inside one of Iran's vast underground missile complexes, a facility built specifically to survive exactly the kind of bombing campaign it's been enduring since February. Tonight, we're not just going to walk through what that footage and the broader reporting around these sites actually shows. We're going to critically examine the claims made by every side of this story, Washington's promises of obliteration, Israel's claims of launchers taken out of operation, and Iran's own propaganda tours through these facilities, because all three of those narratives deserve scrutiny, not just the ones that happen to be convenient for whichever side you're inclined to trust. Here's why this matters beyond military trivia. If Iran's underground missile infrastructure genuinely can't be destroyed through conventional airstrikes, that changes the entire calculus of this war, for Washington, for Israel, and for any diplomatic off-ramp anyone is negotiating toward. A ceasefire built on the assumption that Iran's strike capacity has been crippled is a fundamentally different and far less stable agreement than one that acknowledges Iran can rebuild and keep firing indefinitely. That distinction isn't academic. It's the difference between a war that's actually winding down and one that's simply pausing between rounds. My name is David Whitmore, Chief International Analyst for Breaking News Analysis. Tonight, we're breaking down what's actually documented about Iran's underground missile cities, where the official claims from Washington, Jerusalem, and Tehran diverge from the evidence, and what that gap tells us about how this war actually ends. Let's get into it. Let's start with what's officially, verifiably known, because the underlying engineering here is genuinely remarkable, and it's worth understanding before we get into who's exaggerating what. One of the most extensively documented sites sits near Yazd in central Iran, buried roughly 500 meters beneath the surface. It's carved directly into Kirkuk granite, among the hardest rock formations on the planet, and multiple independent reports describe an interior far closer to a hidden underground city than a conventional military bunker. An automated rail system connecting missile assembly halls, deep storage depots, and several separate exits cut into different faces of the mountain, allowing launch vehicles to roll out, fire, and disappear back underground within minutes. The engineering challenge that geology creates for any attacking air force is straightforward, even if the scale is hard to picture. America's most powerful conventional bunker buster, the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, is designed to punch through reinforced concrete and rock. But according to detailed reporting on the Yazd facility's construction, even that weapon only penetrates roughly 6 to 10 meters into solid granite. When your critical infrastructure sits 500 meters down, the weapon simply runs out of penetrating power hundreds of meters short of anything that actually matters. Analysts at the UK-based Defence Research Institute, RUSI, have made a related point that's worth including here because it reframes the entire problem away from a single weapon and toward the broader mechanics of underground warfare. Destroying a deeply buried facility, according to that analysis, generally requires repeated strikes on the exact same point, precise intelligence about the facility's internal structure, and follow-up attacks specifically timed to prevent rapid repair between bombing runs. That's an extraordinarily demanding combination to sustain over months of continuous warfare. And it's a very different proposition than a single dramatic strike capable of collapsing an entire mountain in one pass, which is often how these attacks get described in official statements and headlines alike. Now hold on, because this is where the official narratives start to diverge sharply from what independent verification actually shows. A CNN investigation examining satellite and ground imagery across Iran's missile infrastructure found that while 77% of visible tunnel entrances had been struck and damaged, activity at those same sites resumed remarkably quickly. Construction equipment was observed returning within days, clearing debris and reopening access routes back into the mountains. Separately, a January assessment from Alma Research, a think tank that has tracked Iran's missile infrastructure for years, reached a similar conclusion using imagery from an earlier round of strikes in 2025. Attacks on surface infrastructure temporarily disabled large launch bases, but any asset actually located deep underground survived intact. That's the fine print underneath the headline, Claims of Obliteration, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Bombing a mountain's entrance is not the same as destroying what's inside it. And that distinction has been true across this entire campaign, not just at one site. Multiple facilities near Isfahan have reportedly been struck by American B-2 and B-52 bombers repeatedly over the course of the war. Yet, according to residents quoted in regional coverage, missiles continue launching from those same mountains the morning after nighttime bombing runs. One resident described watching the smoke rise from the strikes each night, only to see missiles rising from those same mountains again by morning. A striking, on-the-ground description of exactly the resilience these facilities were engineered to provide. The Safa mountain complex south of Isfahan is a useful case study in just how one-sided the visible damage versus actual disruption ratio has been throughout this war. Commercial satellite imagery from providers like Planet Labs, Airbus, and Maxar has continuously documented crater formation, structural collapse at entrances, and smoke plumes following individual strikes, giving outside analysts an unusually transparent, real-time record of the bombing campaign as it unfolded. And yet that same transparent imagery record shows something else just as clearly. Reconstruction activity beginning almost immediately after each strike, entrances reopened, and continued missile activity from the same general area within days. It's rare for a modern military campaign to be this thoroughly documented by independent non-governmental sources in near real time. And that documentation is precisely what allows us to say with real confidence that the obliterated framing doesn't match the visible record. So let's follow the money, or in this case, the engineering timeline, because it explains why this problem was so predictable in hindsight. These aren't hastily dug bunkers thrown together during wartime. Reporting on the broader underground missile network describes construction efforts stretching back decades, deliberately designed around the specific limitations of American and Israeli bunker-busting weapons that Iranian military planners would have studied closely. In other words, Iran didn't get lucky with geology. It appears to have spent years engineering its missile program specifically around the assumption that this exact war, sustained American and Israeli airstrikes, was eventually coming. But here's the catch, and it's an important one for keeping this whole story honest rather than simply accepting the most dramatic version of it. Not every underground Iranian facility has actually survived this war. The Kermanshah underground missile facility, which housed both Qiyam-1 and Fateh 110 ballistic missiles, was struck at 10 separate locations by Israeli airstrikes during the earlier phase of this conflict in mid-2025. An independent assessment from the Institute for the Study of War confirmed that multiple storage buildings and tunnel entrances were destroyed, with entry points and silo openings collapsed. That facility is now formally listed as partially destroyed. So the honest picture here isn't that Iranian underground infrastructure is universally invincible. It's that survivability appears to depend heavily on depth, on the specific rock formation a facility is carved into, and on how many separate strikes a given target can absorb before its access points and internal systems are genuinely compromised. Granted, 500 meters down is a very different engineering problem than a shallower facility built into softer rock. It's worth being precise about why that distinction matters operationally, because it's the real lesson buried inside this comparison. Kermanshah's exposure came from what analysts describe as a combination of shallower construction and a higher concentration of accessible entry points relative to its overall footprint, features that made it a fundamentally more strikeable target than a facility engineered from the outset around the 500-meter depth threshold that defeats current bunker buster technology. In other words, Iran's own underground network isn't uniformly hardened. It's a spectrum ranging from older, shallower sites that this war has already meaningfully degraded, to newer, deeper facilities like Yazd that appear to have been purpose-built, using lessons learned from exactly this kind of vulnerability to survive precisely this kind of war. Now let's turn the same scrutiny toward the claims coming from the other side of this story, because Iran's own messaging deserves exactly as much skepticism as Washington's. State media in Iran has, at multiple points during this conflict, released footage of senior military officials, including the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces and the commander of the Revolutionary Guard's Aerospace Force, personally touring these underground facilities. That footage serves an obvious propaganda function, projecting confidence, deterrence, and resilience to both a domestic audience and to Washington and Jerusalem simultaneously. When you see rows of missiles and drones lined up on camera inside a mountain, you're not looking at neutral documentation. You're looking at a deliberately staged message, and the honest analytical question is what that message is actually designed to accomplish, not simply whether the missiles in frame are real. There's a pattern worth noticing in the timing of these releases, too. Iran's Fars news agency has, on multiple occasions during this war, released footage of fully stocked underground facilities within roughly a week of a major round of strikes, a sequencing that looks less like incidental documentation and more like a calculated response to specific American or Israeli claims of success. When Washington or Jerusalem announces a strike has significantly degraded Iranian capability, footage of an intact, functioning facility tends to follow shortly after. That's not proof the footage is fabricated. The facilities themselves are real, and independent satellite analysis broadly corroborates their existence and continued activity. But the timing tells you this is being run as an active information campaign on Iran's side, coordinated with the war's broader narrative battle, not simply a documentary crew that happened to get access. Here's what nobody sufficiently interrogates when covering this story from either side. Footage of a functioning facility on a specific day doesn't tell you the true remaining scale of Iran's arsenal, any more than a damaged tunnel entrance tells you the facility behind it is destroyed. Both Tehran and Washington have strong incentives to exaggerate in opposite directions, Iran toward appearing undiminished and defiant, the American and Israeli side toward claiming decisive military success. The actual truth, based on the most careful independent assessments available, appears to sit uncomfortably in between. Real, serious damage to surface infrastructure and visible entrances, combined with a deep storage capability that has so far proven very difficult to meaningfully degrade. This is exactly the gap that the 70% stockpile estimate reflects, and it's worth sitting with that number for a moment because of how directly it contradicts the framing this war was sold on. Trump's opening address in February promised total destruction of Iran's missile industry. Israel's own assessment in April claimed most Iranian launchers had been taken out of operation. Neither of those claims squares easily with an intelligence estimate, reported months later, that Iran retains around 70% of both its pre-war missile stockpile and its mobile launchers. That's not a rounding error. That's the difference between a military campaign that achieved its stated objective and one that, by its own government's later intelligence assessments, clearly has not. So why does that gap between promise and outcome matter beyond military accounting? Because it shapes what any actual diplomatic resolution to this war can realistically achieve. If Iran's underground missile production and storage capability remains largely intact, then any ceasefire or memorandum of understanding negotiated without directly addressing that infrastructure infrastructure is, by definition, not actually removing Iran's capacity to resume this conflict on short notice. That's precisely the pattern we've already seen play out once in this war. A ceasefire signed in June, followed by renewed strikes and a reinstated naval blockade in July, once the underlying disagreements resurfaced. An underground missile network that survives negotiations the same way it survived airstrikes is a standing invitation for round three, whenever either side decides the political timing favors it. There's a structural, almost architectural irony worth naming here too, because it says something bigger about the nature of this entire conflict. The most sophisticated air campaign in the world, backed by satellite intelligence, stealth bombers, and the most powerful conventional bunker buster ever built, is being fought against an adversary whose primary defense isn't a weapons system at all. It's geology. 400 million years of granite formation is, functionally, doing more to protect Iran's missile program right now than any Iranian air defense system has managed throughout this entire war. That's not a target you can suppress with electronic warfare or destroy with a better missile. It's simply there, and it will remain there regardless of who wins any individual round of this conflict. Let's talk about what this actually reveals about the broader strategic picture, because that's the layer that matters most once you move past any single facility. Modern precision air power is extraordinarily effective against surface targets, against launchers caught in the open, against buildings, against command centers built at accessible depths. It is far less effective against an adversary that has spent decades deliberately building around exactly that limitation. Iran isn't the first country to figure this out. North Korea's own nuclear and missile infrastructure follows a broadly similar underground logic: extensive tunneling into mountainous terrain specifically designed to survive exactly the kind of precision strikes the United States has spent decades perfecting. China's more dispersed missile basing strategy, while architecturally different, reflects a related insight that concentrated visible infrastructure is a liability against a technologically superior adversary, and depth or dispersal is the more reliable defense. What we're watching play out in Iran right now is a live demonstration of a defense doctrine that's been quietly reshaping how the world's mid-tier military powers plan for exactly this kind of asymmetric confrontation with a more advanced military. It's also worth putting this into the context of where the broader war actually stands right now, because underground survivability isn't just a military curiosity, it's actively shaping the diplomatic timeline. Earlier this year, Washington reportedly issued Iran a 2-month ultimatum demanding it dismantle its nuclear and missile programs entirely, warning of severe consequences if Tehran refused. Iran refused. The war that followed was in large part an attempt to accomplish through force what that ultimatum failed to achieve through diplomacy. Nearly 5 months later, with a large share of Iran's underground missile capacity reportedly still intact, that original ultimatum's core objective, a dismantled missile program, remains, by the government's own later intelligence assessments, substantially unmet. So who actually wins and loses from this underground reality? Once you strip away both sides' messaging, Iran gains real strategic leverage from every additional week its underground capacity survives, because it means Tehran can credibly threaten to keep fighting or keep negotiating from a position that isn't fully desperate, regardless of how much surface damage accumulates. The United States and Israel lose something less tangible, but arguably more important than any single facility: the credibility of total destruction as a stated war aim, a promise that's now been publicly contradicted by their own intelligence community's later assessments. And there's a quieter loser in all of this too, one that rarely makes it into the coverage: ordinary Iranian civilians living near these facilities, whose cities and towns absorb the actual surface damage, the collapsed infrastructure, and the economic disruption of a bombing campaign that, by the numbers we've covered tonight, has not actually achieved the underlying strategic objective it was sold on. There's a less obvious winner, too, worth naming precisely because it doesn't fit neatly into either side's framing. The defense contractors and military planners on all sides of this conflict, now studying this war as the clearest real-world test case in a generation for how deep underground hardening actually performs against modern precision air power. Every strike that fails to reach 500 meters, and every strike that does succeed against a shallower target like Kermanshah, is generating exactly the kind of empirical data that shapes how the next generation of both bunker buster weapons and underground fortification gets designed. In that narrow sense, this war is already reshaping military engineering well beyond Iran's own borders, regardless of how the diplomatic side of the conflict eventually resolves. Here's the paradox worth carrying away from tonight's story. Every side in this conflict has a genuine incentive to overstate its own success. Washington and Israel toward claiming decisive military progress, Iran toward projecting undiminished defiance, and the honest, verifiable picture sits in the uncomfortable space between those two competing narratives. That's not a comfortable place for a wartime information environment to settle, but it's the one the actual satellite imagery, the actual intelligence assessments, and the actual geology all point toward. So here's what to actually watch in the weeks ahead if you want to track which version of this story is closer to the truth. First, watch whether any future strikes specifically target ventilation shafts, rail access points, or logistics infrastructure rather than tunnel entrances alone, since that would signal a shift toward the kind of sustained, repeated targeting that analysts say is actually required to meaningfully degrade a deep facility rather than simply collapsing its front door. Second, watch whether US or Israeli officials revise their public language away from obliteration and toward more measured terms like degradation or disruption, since that kind of rhetorical shift often precedes a genuine change in strategy once a military campaign's original framing becomes politically unsustainable. Third, and most importantly, watch whether any future ceasefire negotiation explicitly addresses underground missile infrastructure at all, because if it doesn't, you'll already know, based on everything we've covered tonight, that whatever agreement gets signed is unlikely to be the last one. The mountain doesn't care what any press conference claims about it. It's been there for hundreds of millions of years, and every strike that's failed to reach 500 meters down is a reminder that some problems in this war were never really about firepower at all. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to Breaking News Analysis for in-depth reporting on the stories shaping America's future. I'm David Whitmore. Thank you for watching.